Now, to understand the significance announced in Ankara, you have to understand what changed to make it possible and what changed to make it necessary. For decades, Europe has accepted what Germans have called an expensive dependency on American military power, or in their phrasings. Not because European leaders didn't understand the risk, but because challenging that dependency felt much more dangerous than maintaining it. At the time, the Europeans didn't feel an existential threat from Russia, and therefore the idea of challenging the United States was an unnecessary one and, well, a very sort of disapproved one. If Europe built its own military capacity, Washington therefore might interpret that as a signal to reduce its own commitment, and suddenly Europe would be left high and dry much sooner than they were ready to plug that gap. Better to keep the Americans engaged simply by remaining somewhat dependent on them. But of course, with all the developments in the past year and a half, perhaps 4 years with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the logic has collapsed, and it's largely collapsed because of one reason or one individual. Well, I think we know who, the orangutan, Mr. Trump. Trump hasn't just pressured European allies to spend more. He's cast doubt on that whole idea of Article 5, the mutual defense clause. He's cancelled these Tomahawk deployments to Germany. He's announced a continual 6-month review of the entire US presence across Europe. And he's proposed punishing allies who didn't meet spending targets by restricting their access to American tech and deprioritizing their arm purchases. And of course, the continued threats on the sovereignty of allied nations like Greenland, or just insulting some of his closest former partners and advocates like Giorgia Meloni, the leader of Italy. All these things demonstrate the strategic short-sightedness of Donald Trump, and that his priority is China or anywhere but Europe. But, well, he's been dragged into a war with Iran of his own choice and hasn't been able to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. So, well, it shows he's not perhaps the best at following through on his threats and often just tacos anyway. Now, the calculation European leaders have been making is that remaining dependent on America was safer than building that independence. That independence is now a vulnerability than a guarantee. An America that might not show up is not an America you can afford to build your entire security architecture around. Indeed, in some cases in parts of Europe, the only defensive capabilities are from the US. There is no physical military in certain countries. They're more like the Coast Guard. But in this case, it's still within the interests of the Americans to remain in Europe, as we've seen through the bases that they've utilized for bombing parts of Iran in the past few months. So what Ankara represents now is the moment Europe internalized that reality and is starting to react, build, develop accordingly. This is way too slow.